order. Please stand for the pledge. Mrs. Carter, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, ma'am. Good to see you. Kathy, roll, please.
Carter. Here. Walther.
Here.
Howe.
Here.
Barstow.
Here.
Hayes. Hicken.
Here.
Lee.
Okay, we have a quorum present. The purpose of this public hearing is to consider the following proposed amendment, which is an amendment to Chapter 1113 and to add Chapter 1115 to the codified ordinances of the City of Pataskala and repeal all other ordinances and parts of the ordinances in conflict therewith. Who's got a presentation for me tonight?
Scott does.
Mr. Fulton, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, sir, and I have placed a copy of the PowerPoint presentation on the dais in front of you. So again, this would be what we've been calling subdivision regulations and the amendment. The current chapter for 1113 was adopted in 2002. This chapter addresses procedure and submittal requirements for subdivisions and lot splits. As we have worked through this for the last couple of years, we've noticed there's some room to improve upon this chapter of the code. And namely, through that improvement, we have created a linear process from start to finish, a more comprehensive list of the requirements for the various plans through the process, and overall this will result in improved development within the city. So the proposed chapter 1113 is an amendment to focus on major subdivisions. Right now it has lot splits and subdivisions in one. We decided to focus on just major subdivisions. And a major subdivision is defined as 6 or more lots or the opening or widening of a road. Because we focused on major subdivisions in 1113, we created chapter 1115, which essentially focuses on lot splits. And this would be a split of less than 6 lots or a transfer of property between adjacent lots. And as I mentioned through this, we have worked with the Public Service Director in the creation of these regulations. So what I'll do is kind of go through, if we have a subdivision, here's the start to finish process, just because we focus on trying to make it linear and easier to follow for both city and developers coming in. So the first step would be a pre-application conference. The subdivider is required to meet with city staff, and a pre-application plan must be brought to the meeting. Within the regulations, the recommended items to be included on the plan is in there. After that, we move on to the preliminary development plan. We've clarified and made the items to submit and include on plans. Planning and Zoning Department is now required to distribute copies for comment. Meeting with staff may be held before the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. A public hearing is now required. Neighbors within 300 feet will be notified. We did have the preliminary plan approval period for 2 years. Following approval, a Mylar set of plans was to be submitted to the Planning and Zoning Department for signatures. Extensions to that 2-year time period may be granted by the Planning and Zoning Commission in increments of 2 years. Any revisions to those plans that are not a typographical error or something along those lines is required to go back to the Planning and Zoning Commission. Following the preliminary plan, we move on to construction plans. The items to submit and to be included on the plans is clarified and more comprehensive. These plans are approved administratively unless an item cannot be agreed upon between the Public Service Director, engineer, and the subdivider, at which case the disagreement, I guess for lack of a better word, would be taken to Planning Commission, or they would have the final say on the issue. Approval of construction plans would be for a period of 3 years. Again, Mylar plans would be submitted for signatures. Extensions may be granted by the city administrator or their designee for a 3-year period. Once we have approved construction plans, we move on to final plans, which is essentially the exact same as a preliminary plan. Following that, we would hold a pre-construction conference. This would be required for any construction activities occur on site permits, schedule, and deposit would be brought to the meeting, and a developer's agreement would be signed. Following that, construction would commence. All construction of public improvements must be done in the presence of an inspector assigned by the city. Improvements constructed in their absence will not be accepted by the city. Construction will be required to follow the approved plans, and erosion and sediment control must be maintained throughout the construction process. Once the construction is completed, we move on to final inspection. The city will inspect those. Any items that fail inspection must be corrected by the subdivider. Following the final inspection, we move on to the acceptance of public improvements. The maintenance bond for public improvements must be provided to the city. City issues a certificate of substantial completion. Then it moves on to acceptance by council by resolution. Following that, we move on to final plat. Again, this is submitted on Mylar to the Planning and Zoning Department for signatures. The signed plat is returned to the subdivider for recording. It must be recorded within 30 days. And once recorded, the subdivider may submit permits for new homes. So it's taken us from start to finish on that. We also added a section on replats. It's mentioned in the current regulations, but it's not really defined. So this would be any alteration to a recorded plat requires a replat. This would go to the planning commission, would have a public hearing, neighbors would be notified, and following that, once approved, then it would follow the platting procedure previously mentioned. Minor subdivisions, which would be chapter 1115, this is essentially lot splits. So a lot split would be less than 6 lots. This would be located on an existing street and meets the subdivision and zoning requirements. And this goes on to outline the submittal requirements and the process for recording once approved. The other type would be an exempted lot split, and this would be the division or conveyance of property between adjoining property owners and would not involve the opening or widening of the road. And again, this goes on to outline submittal requirements and recording requirements. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Mr. Walther?
Yeah, just one quick question. Under the acceptance of public improvements, I'm hopeful, and I believe it probably does, have a acceptance of maintenance agreements, pond, and so forth. Is that included in the subdivision regulations? We've had these issues with some of the detention ponds and other things. Is that a checklist item for you guys?
That's actually in a different section of the code, which I can't repeat off the top of my head.
Okay.
Yeah, that provision would be in, it's covered, I guess, to
As long as it's
define
on
it.
the checklist somewhere.
Specifically, yes, we
Great.
put it in multiple locations where we can make sure those items are covered.
Scott, in your evaluation of all the, as you were writing this, I know I was lucky enough to be involved in some of the committee work for it, but is this in line with surrounding communities type?
For the most part, yes, what we kind of started with the county as a base and decided to move forward from there, but as we looked at other subdivision regulations, particularly at the platting after acceptance by council, I know a lot of communities are doing that. The county does that, Canal Winchester does that, so this kind of brings us in line with how things are going. It wasn't intentional, we kind of created it in what we thought was best for the city, but it does bring us in line with other communities.
I would just say that, I know you've done a lot of work on this, and Mr. Higgins said, we've been in the committee meetings, I think since early last year when you started this, so, I appreciate your diligence in looking through everything and making sure you weeded out all the inconsistencies and got it through, so, good job.
I've been following this somewhat, not as closely as some of the others, but when we accept like a public road and start to plow and mow or whatever we do, is there still a warranty on let's say a curb or a gutter falling apart or a drain pipe sinking or anything like that?
That would be covered in the maintenance bond. And then also, if, for example, they're building a home, and let's say we're outside the maintenance period, and they have a tendency for certain things to drive over the curb, ultimately cracks it and cause damage, part of our certificate of compliance requires that any defects to the curb be corrected. So that way it's not, we're out of the warranty period, now they're driving over the curb as they're building the house, we have provisions in place that if there is an issue, they'll be required to correct it.
So let's say they have to place money in a maintenance bond. How long does that go for?
It's a one-year maintenance bond valued at 10% of the public improvements.
All right, thank you very much. Anything else for Scott? Thank you, sir. Any public comments that would pertain to this public hearing? Okay, seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Moved by Mr. Hicken,
Second.
seconded by Mr. Powell. Discussion and roll.
Carter,
Yes.
Walter,
Yes?
Howe,
Yes.
Barstow,
Yes. Okay,
Hicken,
Yes.
this public hearing is over, and don't get too comfortable. We've got a meeting in 4 minutes.